Do many Christians and churches assume the gospel? Shane asked that question also at these two pastors' conferences.
Do you think we sometimes assume the gospel and we focus on biblical principles for your life, your story, but ultimately the messages are about me, not God's story, not the gospel? What do you think?
I think yes. Having just preached on Sunday and said salvation's really about God, not us, out of Ephesians 1, and that, just could see people kind of cock their head a little bit. What do you mean salvation's not about me? Don't I get saved? Yes, I get saved, but it's about God.
I was at a conference recently with some friends, and they were very kind in assessing the preachers who were preaching. But the most damning thing that any of them would say is, great point here, interesting note there, very amusing story here, only one problem, no gospel. And I think that's the most disturbing thing. I mean, people don't get the gospel unless they hear it preached regularly, unless the gospel is really in every sermon. And I think that's one of the problems. You've pointed it out. I think there's an assumption that people understand what the gospel is. And it's probably a faulty assumption in many, many cases.
Do you think we too often assume the gospel?
I think that's a great temptation, particularly in this culture, where we are so apt to make ourselves the center of everything. By nature, I think pastors tend to be people pleasers, and we want to cater to our congregations. And so oftentimes Sunday becomes just an exhibition, giving the people what they want. Youth ministers see that, and so they kind of tailor their own ministries after that principle.
We can never assume the gospel. As soon as we assume the gospel, we lose the gospel, at least a generation away. And I think we're coming at it backwards. I mean, God's the starting point, not me, not my needs, how God fits my needs. It starts with God, the worldview, the big picture, and then I come well after that. Not me first, and then what is God, how does God fit into my life? It's God, how do I fit into His story, His creation, His world?
The tendency is to figure out how am I going to communicate with my audience, what will gain their hearing, and so the tendency is to preach to what they want to hear. And if they want to hear messages that comfort me, I'm tired, I'm struggling, I'm broken, my relationships, blah blah blah, and so if we speak to that, we end up not speaking to what really is the real need, is that you're not the center of the universe, God is, and so it's that reorienting that is frankly difficult.
I think what ends up happening is that we assume that they want to hear a whole bunch of other things. And, I think there is an assumption out there that people come into church and they want to hear a whole bunch of other things, where the key is that we need to preach Christ crucified.
So do you think it's a failure from the pulpit?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's an assumption there that things have changed so much that, and we use all these different new cliches like postmodern era and all these other things, and we think that everything has changed so much, when in reality it's pretty much the same it was in the first century.
Boy, to back up that last comment, Paul writes to Timothy, but understand this, that in modern and postmodern times, there will come times of difficulty, for people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness but denying its power. And Paul tells Timothy, so be sure to be sensitive to these people in your preaching. No, he says, you, however, have followed my teaching, my conduct, my aim in life, my faith, my patience, my love, my steadfastness, in all of my persecutions. You have the Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. I charge you in the presence of God and of Jesus Christ, who is the judge of the living and the dead, and by his appearing and his kingdom, preach the word. Be ready when it's popular and when it's not. Reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching. For the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions. That's exactly as that pastor said. This is nothing new. I don't even think that it is a desire necessarily explicitly to pander to people, in order to make a sale, in order to, let's put the best motives on pastors out there. I think that a lot of us would say what these pastors have said. There is a problem here of assuming the gospel and starting with ourselves rather than with God, who He is, His problem with us, and what He has done to solve it. And yet I'm not sure what's preached on Sunday, and I don't think it's just because they're pandering. I think a lot of it is, really, we wonder if the gospel, if people believe it, can make them right with God. But we don't really believe that the power for the whole Christian life is in that same gospel.
Yeah,
we're losing our
point.
confidence in the gospel.
That's a great point.
I just another example from someone who wrote in, White Horse Inn listener, said that a friend of theirs from work, very active in the church, her husband was a youth pastor, decided they couldn't go on with their marriage any longer, and her father, the pastor of the church, said he would never speak to her again if she got a divorce. And the husband, the youth pastor, walked out on the faith completely. And then she was just kind of despondent herself, not knowing where to go. And at this point, this listener who wrote in said he and his wife invited her for dinner, and they talked about the gospel. And they gave her White Horse Inn CDs. I mean, you can use all kinds of stuff, but in this case, he gave her White Horse Inn CDs and said, let's talk about it. And so they talked about it, and she just started bawling. She said, can I bring my dad? If there's any chance that my dad will talk to me, bring him here to hear this. And so he did. He came that night, and he started bawling. He broke down, and she said, why have you never told me this before? You were a pastor. I grew up under you, and I never heard this before my whole entire life, and neither did my husband. And he started crying and said, because I hadn't either.
Wow.
And now the father and daughter are reconciled, and so are the wife and husband.
You're kidding.
And they're now in a faithful church, and that pastor's no longer a pastor. He's in a church himself, being cared for as a sheep.
Whoa. Wow.
You hear something like that, and you want to say, you think doctrine's not practical? Shepherds.
Yeah.
We're just that. We're just shepherds.
Yeah.
Just take the meal that Christ has prepared and put it on the table. That's all we're called to do. And trust Him. He's the good shepherd. We're under shepherds. Trust Him to do the work. The gospel is the power of God unto salvation for everyone who believes. Let us have confidence, not only for ourselves, but for our hearers, that is so. We'll look forward to being with you again next time on the White Horse Inn.